But you know what? Maybe a big story, but a lot of Americans, especially those who voted for Donald Trump, they don't seem to care. I was just down in Texas this week. I spoke to a number of people there. They're rather unfazed by it all. A new Wall Street Journal poll, meanwhile, shows nearly 2/3 of voters say the Comey story has not impacted their view of Donald Trump's presidency, not one iota. So why is the media so hyped up? Well, I think we know why. Joining me right now, Howard Kurtz, the host of MediaBuzz on the Fox News channel. Ford O'Connell and Don Calloway are back with me as well. Howie, first over to you. I mean, I'm wondering if Americans are becoming desensitized to a certain extent, in that there's so much news coming their way. It's so anti-Donald Trump. Did they start to just sort of turn it off?
There is something to that, Trish. If every story goes to 11, then nothing seems like an 11. Now, living in Washington as a journalist, I think the firing of Jim Comey, the hiring of Bob Mueller as a special counsel is an important, legitimate story. But in that same Wall Street Journal, NBC poll, it really struck me, asked about the firing of Jim Comey, 29% approved, 38% disapproved, fine. A third had no opinion, and that said to me, a lot of people just not engaged, don't particularly care, haven't been following it that closely, and so for them, it's not the earthquake that it appears here with inside the Beltway.
I mean, I am surprised that some people just simply don't care. I mean, I suppose if you're a Trump supporter, there is a sense, Ford, that, you know, they're out to get him. And they're going to continue being out to get them. And this is just what they do. And you're just saying to yourself, hey, as long as I get a job, as long as my neighbor has a job, as long as my children have a shot at getting a job, as long as I can put food on the table, those are the things that matter. If I have economic security and real security, you know, the rest is just noise.
Well, I think that they first and foremost are concerned about their basic livelihood. But let's be honest, since Donald Trump took office, essentially the mainstream media has beclowned itself. It's jettisoned journalistic integrity in the name of getting one person, Donald Trump. And look at how they do it. Grandiose buzzwords, salacious headlines, anonymous sourcing. Look, Trish, not everything can be Watergate. Forget Flynn. Let's talk about how they covered basically the Russian info sharing. When he has 2 scoops of ice cream and everyone else has 1, it is a top story. What is going on here? And a lot of people are tuning out.
Don, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I want to go back to Howie for a second, because Howie used to work at the Washington Post. I mean, I look at some of the headlines coming out of the Washington Post. And, you know, for a paper that had once prided itself on really being the standard in journalism, it seems as though that has really started to shift. And I wonder, is that Donald Trump, or is that just the marketplace that we live in nowadays, where they're realizing that they need to solve for some kind of narrative? That, in other words, they want their viewership, or their readership, rather, wants to read some of this negative stuff, and thus they're writing it?
Well, at times I've criticized the Post and other news organizations for excessively negative and voluminous and relentless reporting on Donald Trump. At the same time, it was the Washington Post that broke the story about Mike Flynn that ultimately prompted President Trump to fire him. I think what's happening here is 2 things. On the one hand, you know, some of this is self-inflicted. Nobody forced Donald Trump to fire Jim Comey, and that created this firestorm. But at the same time, it feeds the media narrative that there must be something here, these the murky contacts between Trump associates and Russia. We need to get to the bottom of it. When it, in fact, unlike Watergate, we don't know whether ultimately there will be anything there. And that's a perspective I think is all too often lost in some of the breathless coverage and commentary.
And I go back to, Don, the fact that if Comey really felt as though the president was obstructing justice, it was his duty to say something. He didn't say anything.
It was his duty to say something. It was not his duty to say something the next day. He said something in the next 3 months. But I am bewildered that we're talking about this being a media creation. If you notice, we could talk about salacious headlines or the media being hyped up, but nobody is saying, no one on the right is saying that what the Washington Post and other anti-Trump media outlets is saying is false. They're making real claims based upon real evidence. And we might not agree with it.
I mean, we haven't seen the evidence.
We might not agree with it. It might not make us feel good if we're Trump supporters or Republicans, but these are real claims by reputable news organizations.
Here's my problem with all of it. I'm going to jump in.
Being looked into,
Don,
Trish.
As a journalist, you know, you always want a couple sources on something. You don't want to run with something that, you know, maybe just someone may have a personal axe to grind, so to speak.
They are not risking their journalistic careers putting out false information. This is the Washington Post. This is the New York Times. This is not.
So there's a memo. I'll give you that. All right, we're gonna go ahead for it. But you know, there's a memo out there. We don't know what the entire memo says.
And it'll come out.
The New York Times has part of a memo, and this is why perhaps you need some kind of answer here. Maybe the special investigator, that's the right way to go.
And that is great.
And that
you know what?
Ford
And that is the best
will
thing.
get some real information. Over to you, and then I got to run.
But how are we actually basing an entire special investigator essentially on a New York Times article dictated by a third person here? That's
We're not,
absolutely
though, Ford. We're not. We're
Yes.
basing it upon the president's continued malfeasance of the office.
All
Nobody forced him to fire Comey. Nobody forced him to
And
give
he
ISIS
has the
secrets
right
to Russia.
fire Comey. And let me say something
He also
else.
has the right to
No, wait a
declassify
minute.
secrets.
Comey
That doesn't make it
also
morally
told
proper for the
Grassley
president
and fine-
to do for it.
No,
this
that
is
is
the
not
president
true.
of the United
All
States.
You were tell-
All right, guys. I hate to be the kindergarten cop here, but thank you so much. It's going to be a debate we're going to continue.